My name is Dr. Ben Carter, or at least it was. The man who holds that title now is a different person. A ghost haunted by the vast, silent landscapes of the Arizona desert. I was once a man of science, a wildlife biologist who believed that every shadow had a source, every sound a measurable frequency, and every mystery a solution waiting in the data. The wilderness was my laboratory, a grand equation I was determined to solve. It was this belief, this arrogant certainty, that led me to a remote patch of earth near the Navajo Nation, and to a truth that data could never explain and science could never contain. This is the story of the time my world broke, the time I became the subject of a study conducted by something ancient and malevolent. It's the time I saw a skinwalker. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air in this corner of Arizona was a physical presence, a dry, crystalline weight that smelled of sun-baked dust and creosote. My camp was an island of sterile, high-tech efficiency in a sea of ancient, chaotic beauty. I had spent the better part of a week establishing my base of operations, a geodesic tent staked with geological precision, solar panels glinting under the relentless sun, and a perimeter of sophisticated monitoring equipment that hummed with quiet purpose. My mission, funded by a university grant, was to conduct a comprehensive study of coyote pack dynamics. I was here to track their movements, record their vocalizations, and understand their intricate social structures. I was armed with motion-activated thermal cameras, acoustic sensors capable of isolating a single footfall from a mile away, and a crate of GPS tracking collars. I was a digital ghost, here to observe without being observed. I prided myself on my methodology. Every evening, I would check the array, clean the lenses, and calibrate the sensors. The landscape was a masterpiece of geology. Towering mesas painted in bands of ochre and rust, deep canyons that carved wounds into the earth, and a sparse scattering of juniper and sagebrush that clung stubbornly to life. It was beautiful, but to me, its beauty was in its quantifiable nature. The wind, the heat, the very silence, it was all just variables. I knew I was operating on the periphery of the Navajo Nation. I'd seen the signs, respected the marked boundaries, and read the requisite anthropological papers. I understood there were local legends, spooky stories as I dismissively called them to my research assistant, David, over a crackling satellite connection. Stories of shapeshifters, of medicine men who walked a darker path. I categorized them as fascinating folklore, the cultural byproduct of a people living in a harsh, unforgiving environment. They were myths, not data. And I dealt in data. The first anomalies appeared on the third night. They were small, almost negligible whispers in the storm of information my equipment was gathering. My acoustic sensors, programmed to identify and log coyote vocalizations, flagged a series of files for manual review. The first was a perfect, high-pitched coyote yip. Normal. But a microsecond later, the same sensor from the same location recorded the piercing cry of a red-tailed hawk. The two sounds were layered, impossibly close, a duet that broke the laws of biology. A coyote cannot cry like a hawk. I logged it as a potential echo anomaly, a trick of the canyon's acoustics, a fascinating, if explainable, event. The next day, I reviewed the thermal camera footage. My cameras captured the world in a silent ballet of heat signatures. I watched a jackrabbit, a glowing white form against the cool, dark ground, sprint across a clearing. It stopped abruptly, its head swiveling a full 180 degrees on its neck, a movement that would have snapped its spine. It paused for a beat, then continued on its way.
A few hours later, footage from a different camera showed a mule deer, its form graceful and warm, walking backwards for 3 distinct steps before turning and vanishing into the brush. Again, I sought a logical explanation. I typed notes into my log. Anomalous biomechanics observed, possible neurological disorder present in local fauna. Could be a localized contagion or environmental toxin. We'll collect samples for analysis. The thought of discovering a new neurological disease, of publishing a paper on it, was intoxicating. I packaged the compressed data files, the impossible duet of the coyote and hawk, the owl-headed rabbit, and the moon-walking deer, and sent them to David at the university. "You seeing this, Dave?" I said into the satellite handset later that evening, the connection hissing with static. "Fascinating stuff. The canyons must create some kind of sound vortex, and I think we might be onto a new prion disease. The motor functions are all over the place." "Got the files, Ben," David's voice crackled back, a world away in his climate-controlled lab. "Interesting heat signatures. The movements are jerky, uncoordinated. Let me run them through the analysis software. Stay safe out there. Don't get eaten by any of your diseased coyotes." I laughed, a dry, confident sound that the desert swallowed whole. "I'm the one behind the camera, Dave. I'll be fine." I switched off the phone and looked out from my camp chair as the sun bled across the horizon, setting the mesas on fire. The world was sinking into a deep, velvety darkness, and the first stars were appearing in the indigo sky. The wilderness was silent, waiting, and I, Dr. Ben Carter, was waiting with it, my instruments humming, ready to capture and catalog every secret it had to offer. I was the observer. I was in control. The idea that something could be observing me with an intelligence far older and more patient than my own was not a variable I had ever considered.
The morning air was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that would arrive by midday. I followed my routine with a sense of eager anticipation. A quick breakfast of reconstituted eggs, a mug of instant coffee, and then to the business of data collection. I sat down at my laptop, plugged in the ruggedized hard drive from the primary thermal camera overlooking the largest canyon, and began to scrub through the night's footage. The first few hours were a familiar slideshow of glowing desert life. A family of javelinas trotting past, a bobcat, a brief, bright flare of heat as it stalked something in the undergrowth, and the usual parade of rodents and rabbits. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the rhythm broke. The footage showed a small pack of 4 coyotes, their slender, warm bodies moving with familiar canine grace. Suddenly, they froze. Their postures changed from casual foraging to pure, primal terror. Their heads snapped up in unison, ears flat against their skulls. In the silent language of thermal imaging, their panic was a palpable shout. One whined, a shape I could infer from the movement of its jaw, before the entire pat scattered, exploding from the frame in a desperate, chaotic flight. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart rate quickening. What could spook a pack of coyotes like that? A mountain lion? A bear? I scanned the empty frame they had just vacated. For a full 30 seconds, there was nothing, just the cooling ground and the faint heat trails of the fleeing animals. And then it entered. It came from the left side of the frame, from the deep shadows of the canyon wall. It was a bipedal heat signature, but my mind recoiled from what I was seeing. The proportions were nightmarishly wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, moving with the gait that was a sickening parody of human locomotion, a jerky, marionette-like stride that was both impossibly fast and deeply unnatural. It wasn't the smooth, rolling walk of a person, nor the lumbering gait of an ape. It was something else, something that didn't belong in any known phylum.
The head was small, the torso elongated. It moved with a terrifying sense of purpose, not wandering, but tracking. It crossed the clearing in a few horrifying staccato steps, its glowing white form a violation of the natural order. As it reached the center of the frame, it stopped and turned its head, seemingly looking directly at the camera. Then, with the lunge of impossible speed, it moved towards my equipment. The final frame was a blinding, chaotic blur of white heat as the camera was violently knocked over, its view tumbling to the ground where it captured only the silent, unmoving dirt. The clip ended. The screen returned to the file directory. I sat there, frozen, the logical architecture of my mind cracking under the strain of the impossible. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, bloomed in my stomach. This was not a known animal. This was not a data anomaly. This was something else. My first instinct was to debunk it. It had to be a person, a prankster in a suit. But the thermal data was clean. There were no telltale signs of insulating fabric, no variations in temperature that would suggest clothing. The heat signature was uniform, biological. A severe camera malfunction, a corrupted lens creating a distortion, but every other file was perfect. The data was pristine. The movement was fluid, however grotesque. I replayed the file again and again. Each time, the sight of that lurching, predatory form sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I encrypted the file, naming it X0217, and saved it to a separate password-protected drive. The science in me was screaming for analysis, but a more primal part of my brain was screaming to run. I felt a desperate need for supplies, for human contact, for a reality check. The sterile isolation of my camp suddenly felt like a tomb. I grabbed my keys, jumped in my truck, and kicked up a cloud of dust as I sped down the dirt track towards the nearest outpost of civilization, a dilapidated trading post on the edge of the reservation. The trading post was a low, sun-bleached building with a rusty tin roof. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of leather, dust, and old wood. Shelves were laden with canned goods, Pendleton blankets, and intricate silver and turquoise jewelry. An elderly Navajo man with a face like a wrinkled map and long gray hair tied back with a simple leather thong sat behind the counter polishing a piece of silver. He looked up as I entered, his dark eyes seeming to take in far more than just my dusty clothes and anxious demeanor. This had to be Elias. I grabbed a gallon of water and a few bags of beef jerky, my hands trembling slightly. I needed to say something to anchor myself. Trying to sound casual, a feat of acting I was not equipped for, I approached the counter. "Afternoon," I said, my voice hoarse. "Just grabbing a few things." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Been seeing some strange things out in the canyons. Animals acting odd." Elias stopped polishing the silver. He placed it carefully on a velvet cloth. He gave me a long, knowing look, a look that bypassed my scientific credentials and peered directly into the new, terrified space that had opened in my soul. Without me asking, without any prompting, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. "You are a guest here. The land has been here longer than the names you have for it. It watches its guests. Be careful what you follow, and do not, under any circumstances, follow the voice that sounds like your own." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning I couldn't yet grasp but felt with every fiber of my being. A chill, colder than any desert night, ran down my spine. I paid for my items in silence, the transaction feeling surreal. As I walked out the door, back into the harsh, indifferent sunlight, I felt the weight of his gaze on my back. I had come seeking the comfort of the known world and had instead stumbled into the vestibule of a nightmare. The land watched its guests, and I had brought cameras.
Returning to camp was like returning to the scene of a crime. The familiar hum of my equipment no longer sounded like progress. It sounded like an alarm. Elias's words echoed in my mind, a cryptic, looping refrain that I couldn't shake. Do not follow the voice that sounds like your own. The warning felt disconnected from the thermal image I had seen, yet somehow I knew they were pieces of the same terrifying puzzle. That night, the desert psychological assault began in earnest. The entity, the mimic, the impossible heat signature, it was no longer content to be a passive anomaly in my data logs. It was starting to interact. It was starting to learn. I was sitting in my camp chair, trying to distract myself by cataloging rock samples under the cold white light of a battery-powered lantern. I had a nervous habit of whistling when I concentrated, a tuneless, three-note melody I'd been doing since childhood. I whistled it absently, a little puff of sound into the immense silence. A second later, from the deep darkness beyond my fire ring, the exact same three-note melody whistled back at me. It was flawless. Not an echo. An echo degrades, it shifts in pitch. This was a perfect crystalline replication. It was a mockingbird's call, but no bird on earth could produce that specific personal tune. I froze, the rock slipping from my hand and clattering onto the metal table. I strained my ears, listening to the crushing silence that followed. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I grabbed my most powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp white cone into the night, and swept it across the perimeter. Nothing. Just the skeletal forms of sagebrush and the impassive faces of the distant rocks. Then, another sound. A soft beep-boop-beep. My blood ran cold. It was the specific electronic tone my satellite phone made when it successfully connected to the network. It was a sound I had heard dozens of times. But my phone was on the table right in front of me, silent and dark. The sound had come from out there, from the direction of a small, rocky outcrop about 50 yards away. It was listening. It was cataloging the sounds of my world, my technology, my very presence, and playing them back to me. It was a declaration. I see you. I hear you. I know you. The psychological warfare escalated with the setting of the sun each night. The mimicry became its primary weapon, turning my own senses against me. But the true terror, the moment that shattered the last vestiges of my scientific composure, came just before midnight. I was huddled in my tent, a flimsy barrier of nylon against the vast, listening darkness. I was trying to read, trying to force my brain back into its comfortable grooves of logic and reason. "Ben!" The voice was a whisper, carried on the breeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was David's voice. The same cadence, the same slight nasal tone I'd heard 100 times over on the satellite phone. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was impossible. David was in a lab in Southern California, hundreds of miles away. It had to be the wind. It had to be my mind frayed by isolation and fear playing tricks on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white as I gripped my book. It's not real. It's an auditory hallucination. "Ben, can you hear me? I need you to come here." This time it was closer, much closer, just outside the tent. It was a perfect mimic of David's voice, laced with a note of desperate urgency. Elias's warning flooded my mind, a sudden ice-cold dam against the surge of panic. Do not follow the voice that sounds like your own. But this wasn't my voice. It was David's, my friend, my only link to the sane world. It was a brilliant, cruel piece of psychological warfare. The entity was using my connections, my trust, to try and lure me out. It was no longer just mimicking sounds. It was mimicking people.
It was using the voice of my friend as bait. Throughout the night, it continued its campaign. It would replicate the specific, frantic buzzing of a rattlesnake's rattle, seemingly from right behind my head, causing me to flinch violently and scramble away from the tent wall, only for the sound to vanish into an unserving silence. It would play the sound of my satellite phone ringing, the tone piercing the night and sending a jolt of adrenaline through me as I fumbled for the device, only to find its screen dark and lifeless. It whispered my name from different directions simultaneously, making me feel surrounded, besieged by ghosts it had manufactured from my own life. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against my supply crates, a heavy geological hammer in my lap, listening. I was no longer a scientist in a lab. I was a primal creature, cornered and terrified, listening to a monster that had learned to speak with the voices of my friends. The desert was no longer a place of study. It had become a hunting ground, and the mockingbird of the desert was calling my name.
The transition from being an observer to being the observed is a subtle, creeping horror. The transition from being observed to being actively hunted is a gut-wrenching, world-altering plunge. By the fifth day, the clear, demarcated line between my role as a scientist and the subject of my study had not just blurred, it had been erased. I was now the specimen, trapped in a cage of my own making, and the entity was the one conducting the experiment. I woke with the dawn, not from sleep, but from a state of exhausted, hyper-vigilant stupor. The first thing I noticed was that my camp had been edited. The psychological games of the night had bled into the physical world. My carefully arranged geological samples, which I had left in a neat row on my folding table, were now arranged in a perfect, deliberate spiral, like a nautilus shell or a galaxy. It was precise, intelligent, and utterly unnerving. It was a message. I can enter your space. I can touch your things while you tremble in your tent. This is my laboratory now. Then I saw the print. In the fine gray dust near the flap of my tent, there was a single deep impression. It was not the track of a coyote or a deer. It wasn't human. It was large, vaguely hand-like, with long, thin digits, but it had a shape and structure that belonged to no creature I had ever seen documented. The most terrifying part was its solitude. There was only one print. No other tracks led to it, and none led away. It was as if something had descended from the sky, pressed its hand into the earth, and then vanished back into the air. The days, once a reprieve from the auditory terrors of the night, now offered their own unique brand of dread. I felt a constant, oppressive weight on me, the physical sensation of being watched. The sun offered no safety, only a clearer view of the vast, empty spaces where my tormentor could be hiding. I took to scanning the tops of the distant mesas with my binoculars, my hands shaking. I'd catch flickers of movement, a shape that seemed to detach itself from the rock, a shadow that moved against the sun, but whenever I focused, there was nothing there. It was a master of the landscape, using the heat haze and the natural camouflage of the desert to remain just on the edge of perception. The hunts became more aggressive that afternoon. I decided to hike to one of my more remote camera traps, needing to feel proactive, to do something other than cower in my camp. The trail was narrow, winding through a dry wash littered with smooth, sun-bleached stones. As I walked, I heard it. The distinct crunch of heavy, bipedal footsteps on the gravel just behind me. It was the sound of someone wearing boots, walking with a steady, deliberate pace. Crunch, 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 keeping pace with me, just out of sight. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, the geological hammer held up like a weapon. There was nothing. The empty wash stretched out behind me, shimmering in the afternoon heat.
The sound had been utterly, convincingly real, yet the space behind me was devoid of life. It was toying with me, using my own expectations of reality as a weapon. I was being stalked by a phantom, hunted by a ghost that could manipulate the very air. I scrambled back to camp, my scientific mission forgotten, replaced by a singular, primal goal: survival. I managed to get a connection on the satellite phone. David's voice, his real voice, was a lifeline. David, David, you there? I whispered, my voice a ragged, panicked rasp. I was huddled behind my truck, as if the metal could shield me. Ben, you sound terrible. What's going on? I tried to explain, the words tumbling out of me in a chaotic, desperate stream. It's mimicking you, David. It's making sounds, moving my things. There are tracks, impossible tracks. I saw a thermal signature. It's bipedal, but it's not human. It's hunting me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only with the hiss of static. When David finally spoke, his voice was filled with a careful, clinical concern that was more devastating than disbelief. Ben, I'm looking at the sensor logs right now. I'm getting your audio feed. It's dead silent out there. The thermals are clean. There's nothing on the data, man. Are you sure you're sleeping enough? The isolation, the dehydration, it can cause severe auditory and visual hallucinations. Maybe you should think about packing it in. His words hit me like a physical blow. Gaslighting. It was unintentional, the logical conclusion of a scientist looking at clean data, but it was devastating. He was using my own science, my own trusted methodology to invalidate my reality. The entity had successfully isolated me, not just physically, but psychologically. My last link to the sane world thought I was losing my mind. The data was clean, the sensors were silent, and I was alone with the monster that the data could not see.
My scientific worldview, the bedrock of my identity, was not just cracked, it was crumbling into dust. Yet a stubborn part of my mind, the part that had dedicated its life to observation and evidence, still clung to a sliver of hope for a rational explanation. A hallucination, a complex prank, a neurological event. I held on to these possibilities like a drowning man clutching at debris. That was until the afternoon of the sixth day, when I was granted a glimpse of the truth, a sight so horrifying and reality-bending that it snuffed out the last embers of my skepticism forever. I had retreated to a high vantage point, a rocky ledge overlooking a wide, sun-drenched valley. I felt safer in the open, with a clear line of sight. My camp below felt tainted, a stage for the entity's games. I was using my high-powered binoculars, a tool of science that now felt like a ward against the dark, to scan the valley floor. I was ostensibly looking for my diseased coyotes, but in truth, I was looking for it. My lenses found a lone coyote trotting near a cluster of parched mesquite trees. It was a healthy-looking specimen, its coat thick, its movements live. I watched it for a few minutes, its normal, predictable behavior a soothing balm. It stopped, sniffing the air, and then it turned its head to look directly up towards my position, as if it knew I was there. Then it began to contort. The change was not sudden, like a magic trick. It was a slow, sickening biological process. The coyote's body shuddered violently. Its front legs began to stretch, the bones audibly cracking and popping, elongating at an impossible rate. Its spine lengthened, forcing its torso upwards. The fur seemed to melt and recede into pale, stretched skin. The snout flattened, the jawline reshaping itself into something hideously anthropomorphic. In the shimmering heat haze of the desert floor, its form twisted and reshaped itself, like clay being molded by an unseen, malevolent artist.
For a single, soul-searing second, I saw it. It stood on two long, spindly legs, a tall, gaunt humanoid figure. Its skin was the color of bone, stretched taut over a frame that was all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging nearly to its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I saw its eyes. They were pale, and they seemed to glow with a faint internal luminescence, even in the bright sunlight. They were fixed on me. The moment lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Then, as if the effort was too great, the figure collapsed in on itself. The limbs shortened, the spine curved back down, fur sprouted, and in a final fluid ripple of motion, it was a coyote again. It shook its head once, as if clearing it, and then sprinted away, vanishing into the brush with a speed that was utterly animalistic. I lowered the binoculars, my body trembling uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I finally understood. The owl-headed rabbit, the deer that walked backwards, they weren't sick animals. They were the entity. They were masks. The Skinwalker wasn't a man wearing a coyote skin as a costume. It was something that could become the coyote, wear its form from the inside out. It was a true shapeshifter. The final, horrifying realization washed over me, a wave of intellectual and existential dread so profound it almost buckled my knees. My entire scientific methodology had been turned against me. I had come here to observe, to be the invisible eye. I had set up my cameras, my acoustic sensors, my entire high-tech surveillance network, believing I was studying the secrets of the wilderness. I had been wrong. I wasn't the one conducting the study. I had simply built a state-of-the-art observation post for the entity. It had used my cameras to see how I moved, my sensors to learn how I sounded. It had studied my routines, my habits, my technology, my very whistling. From the moment I arrived, I hadn't been the scientist. I had been the specimen pinned on a board, and the Skinwalker had been the one taking notes. Panic is a poor navigator. It doesn't find the quickest route. It finds the most frantic one. I half ran, half stumbled down from my observation post. The image of the transforming coyote burned onto the back of my eyelids. My camp, my $1 million island of science, was no longer a sanctuary. It was the creature's territory. I didn't pack. I grabbed my wallet, my keys, and the water bottle from my truck's cup holder. I left the laptops, the solar panels, the GPS collars, the carefully collected samples. All of it. It felt tainted, poisoned by the entity's attention. It was a monument to my own hubris, and I wanted nothing more to do with it. I drove with a reckless urgency, the truck bouncing violently over the rutted dirt road. There was only one place to go. One person who had looked at me not as a scientist, but as a man trespassing in a world he did not understand. When I burst through the door of the trading post, I must have been a terrifying sight. My face was pale under a layer of dust and sweat, my eyes wide with the fear that went beyond simple fright. Elias was there, sitting in the same chair as before, a piece of unfinished jewelry in his hands. He looked up at me, and his expression wasn't one of surprise, but of grim expectation. He knew I would be back. I didn't hold back. The words poured out of me, a torrent of terror and broken logic. I told him everything. The mimicking sounds, David's voice in the darkness, the spiral of stones, the single handprint in the dust. My voice cracked as I described the coyote, the sickening contortion of its body, the pale, glowing eyes of the thing it became. I wasn't talking to a colleague or a friend. I was giving a confession. Elias listened patiently, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He nodded slowly, a deep, ancient sadness in his expression. When I was finished, gasping for breath in the cool, quiet air of the shop, he set his work aside. "You have seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. "These things, the ye nal the she, they are drawn to those who intrude, to those who pry. They are beings of deep wilderness and shadow, and they hate to be seen. They hate to be named, to be documented." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Your machines, your recordings, to them it is a profound insult, a challenge. You did not come to live with the land, you came to capture it, to pin it down and write its name on a tag. So it decided to study you instead." His words confirmed the horrifying realization I'd had on the ridge. I had been the specimen all along. "What do I do?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "How do I make it stop?" "You cannot make it stop," Elias said, his voice flat and final. "You can only survive it. You have given it your sound, you have given it your image. Now you must deny it your fear." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. He gave me the rules, the ancient, hard-won knowledge of survival passed down through generations that had lived alongside this terror. It is a creature of the wild, profane places. It fears the sanctity of the hearth, the home. Fire is your only friend, a real fire, not your machine lights, and the circle of its light is your only sanctuary. He looked at me with an intense seriousness. Its greatest weapon is the one it is using now, the mimicry. It seeks to break the mind before it touches the body. It will use the voices of those you love to draw you out into the dark. It will make you believe they are in danger, that they need you. It is a lie. Everything it says is a lie to get you to take one step out of the light. Do not answer. Do not speak to it. Stay in the light. Stay in the circle. Survive until the sun rises. I left the trading post a changed man. The scientist was gone, stripped away by terror. I drove a few miles down the main road, pulling off onto a patch of flat, open ground, far from the canyons and mesas of my research site, but still frighteningly isolated. I abandoned my high-tech camp in my mind. Following Elias's instructions, I gathered rocks and built a large, crude fire ring. I used the emergency fireware I carried in the truck bed and doused it with the last of my lighter fluid. As dusk began to settle, casting long, menacing shadows across the landscape, I struck a match. The flames caught, growing quickly into a roaring, crackling blaze. I was no longer a 21st century biologist. I was a primitive man, huddled by a fire, praying for the dawn, waiting for the monster to come.
The night did not fall. It consumed. The vibrant colors of the desert were swallowed by a deep, star-pricked blackness that felt absolute. My world shrank to the pulsating circle of light cast by my fire. It was a small, fragile island of warmth and visibility in an ocean of menacing dark. The fire was my anchor, the crackling of the logs the only sound I trusted. Outside that circle, the hunt began its final, brutal phase. The Skinwalker, angered by my flight, enraged by this new primal defense, made its presence known immediately. It didn't bother with subtlety now. It began to circle my camp. Its movements a constant, unnerving presence just beyond the reach of the firelight. I didn't need to see it. I could hear it. I heard the crunch of its unnatural bipedal footsteps on the dry earth, sometimes slow and deliberate, sometimes scuttling with the horrifying speed. Then came the sounds, an impossible collage of its learned vocabulary.
It unleashed a cacophony designed to shred my sanity. The yip of a coyote blended seamlessly into the screech of a hawk, the frantic buzz of a rattlesnake layered over the electronic beep of my own equipment. My name, Ben, was whispered in David's voice, first from the left, then immediately from the right, creating the terrifying illusion of multiple tormentors. It was a symphony of psychological terror, and I was its sole audience. I sat on an overturned crate, feeding log after log into the fire, my eyes fixed on the dancing flames. I remembered Elias's words, "Stay in the light. Stay in the circle." The fire was more than just heat. It was a boundary, a sacred line the entity seemed unwilling or unable to cross. But it had one more weapon, its most powerful, a weapon aimed not at my ears, but at my heart. From the deepest part of the darkness, a new voice emerged. "Ben? Oh God, Ben, help me!" It was the voice of my wife, Sarah. It wasn't a recording, it wasn't a memory. It was her voice, present and real, laced with the terror so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was the voice she'd used once when she'd cut her hand badly in the kitchen, a sound of pure, unfeigned panic and pain. It was a voice this thing could not have heard over a satellite phone. It must have plucked it from my own thoughts, my own memories. "Ben, please, I'm out here. I'm hurt. I fell." The voice was choked with sobs, sounding as if it was coming from just a few feet away, right outside the circle of light. My entire being screamed to act. Every protective instinct, every fiber of my love for her surged through me. My muscles tensed, my head started to turn. It was a direct, brutal emotional assault designed to override all logic, all warnings. Elias's face flashed in my mind. It will use the voices of those you love to draw you out into the dark. It is a lie. The climax of my ordeal was not a physical fight, but a silent, agonizing battle of will. I was torn between the deepest, most primal instinct a man has, to protect his family, and the cold, hard-won warning of the old Navajo. The voice pleaded, it cried, it begged me to come to her. It called my name with the desperate, heartbreaking urgency. "Why won't you help me, Ben? I'm scared." I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. I began to chant, my voice a low, trembling whisper against the sobs in the darkness. Lithosphere, astenosphere, mesosphere, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic. I recited geological terms, scientific facts, anything to anchor my logical mind against the overwhelming emotional onslaught. I stared into the heart of the fire, the flames searing my vision, refusing to look into the darkness, refusing to answer the call. The man of science was fighting one last battle, using his knowledge not to understand the world, but to build a fortress against it. I stayed within the firelight. I did not answer. I did not move. A long, tense silence fell. The pleading sobs stopped. Then the entity, denied its prey, its most clever lure ignored, let its mask slip at last. It let out a final, enraged sound. It was not a mimic. It was not a human or animal sound. It was its own true voice. It was a horrifying, inhuman shriek of pure malice and frustration, a sound that ripped through the fabric of the night, a sound of ancient hatred and frustrated hunger. It echoed through the desert, a sound that the canyons themselves seemed to fear, before it finally, blessedly, faded into silence. And then there was nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and the sounds of my own ragged breathing.
I survived the night. I don't know if I slept or passed out from exhaustion, but when I opened my eyes, the first gray light of dawn was painting the eastern sky. The fire had dwindled to a pile of glowing orange embers. The air was still, cold, and blessedly silent. The presence was gone. The oppressive weight, the feeling of being watched, had lifted. The world felt clean again. I didn't wait. I didn't ponder. I moved with the jerky, efficient motions of a survivor. I kicked dirt over the embers of the fire, packed my few personal belongings into my truck, and got in. I didn't look back at the makeshift fire ring. I didn't even glance in the direction of my abandoned research camp, a multi-$1,000 monument to my former life, now just a piece of high-tech trash for the desert to reclaim. I put the truck in drive and sped onto the pavement, not looking in the rearview mirror until the sun was fully risen and the landscape of my terror has shrunk to a line on the horizon. Back at the university, the world of clean fluorescent lights and climate control felt alien. People talked about deadlines and budgets and football games. I felt like a ghost, a man out of time. I sat down at my office computer, the key card feeling foreign in my hand. I accessed the university's remote server and navigated to my project folder. I found the encrypted thermal video file, X0217. I stared at the name for a long moment, the memory of that lurching, white-hot figure vivid in my mind. Then I dragged the file to the trash bin and hit empty trash. I found the anomalous audio files, the coyote-hawk duet, David's mimicked voice, my own whistle echoing back at me, and deleted them too. My official report was a masterpiece of scientific obfuscation. I stated that the study was inconclusive. I cited catastrophic equipment failure due to unforeseen and extreme environmental factors, including dust contamination and severe temperature fluctuations. I wrote that the data had been corrupted beyond recovery. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. I knew no one would ever believe the truth. And more than that, I knew that publishing my findings, sharing that video would be an act of profound arrogance and danger. It would be naming the entity as Elias had warned. It would be an insult that could draw its attention again, perhaps to someone else. I would not be responsible for that. I was honoring the old man's wisdom. I quit my job the following week. My resignation cited personal reasons. How could I continue? How could I ever look at the natural world through a lens again, with the same sterile scientific detachment? I understood now in a way that resonated in my very bones that some things are not meant to be quantified. Some things are not meant to be cataloged or observed. Some mysteries are not problems to be solved, but truths to be respected from a great, great distance. Months passed. I took a quiet desk job as a data consultant for a geological survey firm. I analyzed soil composition reports from a cubicle in a high-rise building surrounded by the comforting, predictable geometry of a city. The wilderness was a memory, a nightmare I kept locked away. Then David called. My former assistant, his voice a cheerful intrusion from a life that was no longer mine. "Hey, Ben, weirdest thing," he said. "The university is finally clearing out those old hard drives from your Arizona trip to reallocate them. Most of the data was corrupted, just like you said. Total mess. But there's one tiny password-protected audio file I can't crack. It's an orphan file, not linked to anything. It's just labeled, 'Don't Listen.'" I swiveled in my chair and looked out the window at the safe, urban landscape below, at the grid of streets and the predictable flow of traffic. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I knew what file he was talking about. A desperate recording from that final night, the shriek, I would never know. Some doors must remain closed. "Just delete it, David," I said, my voice low and steady, a command.
Trust me, just delete it.